My name is Lauren Blake, and if anyone saw our family from the outside, they would say we were lucky. A well-kept house in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, a neat lawn, a white picket fence, a mother in formal suits, and a father with a briefcase, which he always carried as if it contained something important and life-changing. We looked like an advertisement for the proper American life, stable, sensible, secure. But behind this facade, there was always a silence, tense and cold, like glass just before it cracks. My mother, Catherine, worked as a financial consultant for a large insurance company. She loved to talk about interest rates, investment portfolios, and pension funds as if they were living beings deserving of respect. For her, work wasn't just a source of income, it was armor. She put it on every morning, along with a perfect hairdo and flawless lipstick. When she returned home, she would put her bag by the door, take off her shoes, and immediately check her mail or make calls to clients, as if the house were an extension of the office. My father, Michael, was an analyst at the Department of Urban Development. Paperwork, reports, meetings. He never complained, but I saw his eyes light up on the rare occasions when he talked about something else. Sometimes, over dinner, he'd draw diagrams on napkins with a pen, coffee shops with unusual concepts, mobile services, ideas that, as he said, could change the game. Imagine, Kat, he said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the thought, a network of small urban spaces where people don't just shop, but feel part of something. My mother looked up from her plate, and there was no anger in her gaze. Only irritation and weariness. Michael, we've already discussed this. We have a mortgage, school, health insurance. I don't want to live in constant risk. I was little then, 6 years old, and it seemed to me that Dad's ideas were like fairy tales. They contained movement, hope, adventure. But Mom's world was all about numbers, where everything had to add up to the last cent, or else disaster would follow. The real disaster happened one evening that I'll never forget. I was sitting on the carpet in my room, arranging plastic animals, when a scream came from below. Not a raised voice, not an argument, a scream, piercing, alien. What have you done? I went to the door and opened it slightly. Mom was pacing the living room, clutching some papers. Her face was red, her eyes were shining. You took out a loan without my consent. Her voice trembled. Do you even understand what this means? Catherine, listen. Dad stood opposite me, too calm, and this seemed to anger her even more. I've calculated everything. This isn't madness, it's a chance. A chance to be left with nothing, she cried. I'm not going to drown with you. I didn't understand the words, but I felt the fear filling the house. The next morning, Dad was gone. Not forever. That's what they told me. He'd temporarily moved in to work on his project. He didn't come to say goodbye. Mom said he didn't want to wake me. At first, I waited. I listened to the sound of the car every evening. Then I stopped. Months passed. Dad's project had unexpectedly succeeded. I knew it from the way Mom looked at the envelopes that arrived in the mail. Money. Child support. She never spoke about Dad directly, but sometimes, talking on the phone with friends, I heard phrases spoken with bitterness. Yes, he succeeded. Can you imagine? After my father left, Mom worked even harder. A nanny came into our house, Rosa, a woman with a soft voice and warm hands. She was the one who put me to bed, took me to school, and listened to my stories. Mom is trying so hard for you, Rose would say. But I knew Mom wasn't trying so hard for me. She was trying so she wouldn't have to think. The only person who brought life into the house was Grandma Helen, Mom's mother. She lived in Indiana and rarely visited, but her visits were always accompanied by laughter, the smell of baked goods, and scandals. You destroyed the family, she said once, thinking I couldn't hear. Because of fear and pride. Don't you dare judge me, Mom would reply coldly. After such conversations, Grandma would always find me, hug me, and tell me I was fine. Back then, I didn't understand why her words were so important. When I was 7, my grandmother insisted I go to a private school in a nearby neighborhood. My mother didn't object. The less time I spent at home, the easier it was. As I got older, I began to notice something strange. My mother looked at me as if I weren't her daughter, but a reminder. When I took the initiative, rejoiced at my successes, something cold appeared in her eyes. I reminded her too much of my father, his confidence, his stubbornness. Physically, I had everything. Emotionally, I was empty. My mother never hugged me without reason. She never said, "I love you." She'd go away on weekends with colleagues, and I'd stay with Rosa or my grandmother. I thought that's how everyone lived. Until one day, I found myself at a classmate's birthday party. I saw her mother laughing, wiping up spilled juice, kissing her daughter on the top of her head, saying words that didn't require a reason. That evening, for the first time, I thought something was wrong with me. Or maybe something hadn't happened to me. I didn't yet know that pain, envy, betrayal, and years of struggle lay ahead. I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. But it was then, in the house with the neat facade, that I first felt loneliness, deep, quiet, the kind that stays with you for a long time. I was 9 when my mother brought a new man into the house for the first time in many years. His name was Thomas Reed, and he was different from all the men I'd seen before. He didn't talk about percentages or strategies, didn't wear formal suits even on weekends, and had a laugh that was infectious. Thomas worked as an engineer at a telecommunications company and seemed surprisingly simple. He brought me candy bars, showed interest in my school, and once even came to my school play and applauded louder than anyone else. I decided then, maybe everything would change. Maybe Mom would be different if someone else came into her life. I wanted to believe that love was contagious. They married quickly, without any pomp and ceremony, simply registering their marriage at Dayton City Hall, and that evening the three of them had dinner at a small restaurant. Mom looked calm, even gentle. That evening, for the first time in a long time, she stroked my head. I remembered that touch as if it were something rare and fragile. And then Mom told me she was pregnant. The news caused a storm of emotions. Thomas was happy. He talked about the future, about trips, about teaching his child to ride a bike. I smiled and nodded, trying not to think about what was growing inside me, a strange feeling of anxiety, as if I was standing on the edge, about to be displaced. My half-sister was born in early fall. They named her Madison. She was tiny, with rosy cheeks and dark hair. And with her arrival, I saw the mother I'd never known. Mom had changed. She spoke softly, laughed, sang lullabies. She held Madison in her arms for hours, even when she was sleeping. I watched from the sidelines, standing in the nursery doorway, feeling something clench inside. I wasn't jealous. At least, that's what I told myself. I just didn't understand. Why couldn't they do the same to me? Why did these words, these kisses, these smiles only appear now? I tried to earn attention. I helped around the house, brought home excellent grades, talked about my accomplishments. Mom listened absent-mindedly, her eyes never leaving the baby. "Wait, Lauren," she said. "I'm busse." These words became the backdrop to my life. As Madison grew older, the difference between us became even more noticeable. If I dropped a glass, I'd get a stern scolding. If Madison broke a toy, Mom would laugh and say she was too little. Thomas sometimes tried to be fair, but most often he preferred not to interfere. He loved the peace in the house and didn't want to disturb it. I increasingly went to visit Grandma Helen. She had an old house in Fort Wayne, with creaky floors and endless patience. She listened to me, asked questions, hugged me as if she were afraid I'd disappear. "It's not your fault," she'd say. Sometimes adults can't handle their feelings. But words don't always heal. By the age of 12, Madison understood how our family worked, and she understood it all too well. At first, it was little things. She'd take my things without asking, break them, and then cry when I reprimanded her. Lauren yelled at me. She sobbed, clinging to her mother. Mom didn't even ask what happened. She just looked at me with cold disappointment. "You're older, be smarter." Gradually, it became a pattern. Lost change, broken school supplies, things that suddenly appeared in my room. Every time, I tried to explain, but my words were drowned out by the predetermined sentence. "I don't know what's wrong with you," Mom would say, "but you're becoming a problem." That phrase ingrained itself in me deeper than any punishment. By the time I was 14, I'd stopped making excuses. I realized the truth wasn't important to anyone. Madison, however, was becoming more and more confident. She'd look at me with a slight smile when my mother sent me to my room or forbade me from going out with friends. There was no childish naivety in those looks, only cold calculation. One night, I overheard my parents talking. I was going to the kitchen for water and froze at the bedroom door. "She's too complicated," Thomas said. "Maybe it would be better for her to spend more time with your mother?" "As long as the child support is paid," my mother replied. "Let her live here. We'll figure it out later." At that moment, something inside me finally broke. I realized I wasn't her daughter. I was an obligation, a reminder, a source of income that allowed her to live the way she wanted. From that day on, I began preparing to leave. I immersed myself in my studies, signed up for extra classes, and stayed at the library until closing time. Home became a place where I simply slept. This angered Madison. "You think you're special?" she hissed sometimes. "You're nobody here." I didn't answer. I counted the days. I didn't yet know that an event lay ahead that would change everything forever. That one mistake, one lie, would lead to the point of no return. But it was during these years that I learned the most important thing: to survive in silence and make plans in silence. By 17, I was living a double life. At school, I was known as a calm, collected student with an impeccable reputation. Teachers entrusted me with difficult projects. Classmates asked for help with exams. I learned to smile just enough to avoid unnecessary questions. Home, however, was a place where I existed on a level playing field, trying not to leave a trace, not to make noise, not to be seen. Madison grew quickly and confidently, as if the world had affirmed her right to everything from childhood. By 15, she knew perfectly well how to exploit her mother's trust. She knew how to cry on demand, choose the right words, and change her intonation. Sometimes it seemed to me she rehearsed her scenes in advance. Thomas still preferred to remain aloof. He often worked late, and if he was home, he'd retreat to the garage or stare at the TV. He disliked conflict and seemed to sincerely believe that if you didn't interfere, everything would somehow work itself out. I, meanwhile, spent more and more time outside the house. The library became my refuge. It was quiet, safe, and no one accused me without proof. I was preparing to apply to a university in another state, dreaming of moving as far away as possible. Grandma Helen supported me as much as she could. Sometimes she'd call and ask if I needed help. I always replied that I could handle it, even though I'd been feeling tired inside for a long time. The first serious signs of trouble appeared in the winter. First, Mom's jewelry, a pair of earrings and a necklace, went missing. Madison soon found them in my desk drawer. Mom didn't even listen to my explanation. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," she said wearily. "I'm ashamed of you." Then the money disappeared from Thomas's wallet. It was neatly folded in my coat pocket. I realized the situation was spiraling out of control. But even then, I didn't expect how far it would go. It happened in March, on a typical weekday. I returned from school earlier than usual. The last class had been canceled. The house was unusually quiet. At first, I thought no one was home, but then I smelled a scent. At first, faint, barely perceptible, then sharp, bitter. The smell of smoke. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear my own footsteps. I went down to the basement and saw a scene that still haunts me at night. In the corner, among old boxes and newspapers, a fire was burning. Small, but already dangerous. The flames were creeping up to the wooden shelves. And next to me, crouched, was Madison. She held a lighter in her hand. She stared at the flames with a strange, almost mesmerized expression. "Are you crazy?" I screamed, rushing toward her. Are you trying to burn the house down? She looked up at me. There was no fear in them, only irritation at being distracted. I grabbed her by the shoulders and yanked her back, away from the fire. It all happened in seconds. She stumbled, lost her balance, and fell to the concrete floor. There was a dry sound that sent a shudder through me. Madison screamed. I simultaneously put out the fire and dialed Mom. My hands were shaking, my voice breaking. "There's a fire," I said. "Madison's hurt. Come immediately." Mom rushed in with Thomas. They didn't even glance at the basement. They saw only Madison, sitting on the couch, her hand pressed to her chest, tears in her eyes. Her arm was already starting to swell, and it was clear the fracture was real. "She pushed me," Madison said, choking back tears. "She did it on purpose. She's always hated me." I tried to talk, to explain, to show the charred boxes, the smell of smoke. Mom looked at me as if I was speaking a different language. "Enough," she said. "I heard everything." At the hospital, they wouldn't even let me into the room. By the time they got home, the decision had already been made. Mom came into my room and silently began gathering my things, throwing them into large trash bags. "Mom, please." I stood there, unsure of where to go. There was a fire. I saved the house. "Get out," she said, without looking up. "If you don't leave now, I'll call the police. I'll say you attacked your sister." I realized there was no point in arguing. All the previous evidence against me had done its job. They wouldn't believe me. Not then, not ever before. I left the house with one bag of clothes. The rest was left on the lawn. It was cold. The wind whipped my jacket, and my head was filled with a ringing void. I walked to my grandmother's house, my legs numb. Helen opened the door and immediately understood. She didn't ask anything. She simply hugged me, and in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to cry. From that day on, my life was divided into before and after. I graduated from high school, applied to university, received a scholarship. Mom didn't come to graduation. Madison didn't call. It was as if I ceased to exist for them. But it was then, at rock bottom, that I found clarity. I no longer expected love where it had never been. I decided to build my life so that no one would have power over me anymore. I didn't yet know that the past would return, that they would need something from me again, and that this time I would be ready. When I left the house in Columbus, I felt like I was leaving everything behind with it. My childhood, my hopes, my pain, my expectations. In fact, I was taking it all with me, just in a different form. The first months with my grandmother were like life after a storm. It seemed like there was a roof over my head, but the wind was still blowing inside. I woke up at night at every rustle, flinched at sharp sounds, automatically ready to defend myself, justify myself, prove myself. Helen saw this, but she didn't rush me with conversations. She was simply there, and that was enough to keep me from falling apart completely. I graduated from high school in Fort Wayne. The journey was long, but I didn't complain. School became my anchor. I knew that if I got distracted, if I allowed myself to wallow in resentments, I would lose. And I wasn't about to lose anymore. I applied to several universities at once, choosing those farther away from Ohio. I didn't just want to move away, I wanted to start with a clean slate. When the letter arrived about a full scholarship to the University of Missouri, I read it 10 times over, in disbelief. My grandmother cried, holding the letter in her hands, repeating how proud she was of me. In that moment, I realized everything that had happened to me hadn't broken me. It had made me stronger, even if I didn't yet fully realize it. Moving was a strange experience. I lived in a dorm, shared a room with a girl I didn't know, learned to cook simple meals, and make every dollar count. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. No one accused me without reason. No one looked at me with suspicion. I could be myself, not perfect, not uncomfortable, just me. I chose a program focused on management and analytics. Numbers, which I had previously associated with the coldness of my mother's world, now became a tool. I learned to see patterns, spot errors, and understand where the system was failing. My teachers noted my perseverance and attention to detail. I wasn't the brightest student, but I was one of the most reliable. I didn't communicate with my mother. Occasionally, she'd send dry messages about paperwork or formalities, but they contained neither remorse nor interest. I'd stopped expecting more. Madison existed for me only as a memory, unpleasant, but no longer painful. My grandmother remained the only link to my past. We talked on the phone almost every evening, and these conversations helped me maintain a sense of home. After graduation, I got a job at a consulting company in St. Louis. The work was stressful but interesting. I analyzed reports, identified inefficient processes, and helped businesses optimize costs. My colleagues respected me for my professionalism. No one knew my history, and I liked that. My past no longer defined my present. A few years passed. I rented my own apartment, made friends, and learned to relax without feeling guilty. And that's when Ethan came into my life. We met by chance at a small bakery next to the office. He was standing ahead of me in line, and when the barista mixed up our orders, we burst into laughter. That laughter sparked a conversation that continued at a table by the window, then at dinner, then on evening strolls through the city. Ethan owned a chain of small cafes across the state. He worked hard, but he knew how to enjoy the little things. He had no need to control or prove anything. It was easy being with him. I didn't tell him about my family for a long time. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid of being vulnerable again. But one day, sitting on his balcony, I finally told him. He listened attentively, without interrupting, without giving me unsolicited advice. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said. "But I'm glad you are." We had a modest wedding, without fanfare. My grandmother came and beamed with happiness. My mother didn't come. I knew this in advance and was prepared for it. This day belonged to me and my new life. A few months later, Ethan invited me to join his business. He knew what I did and trusted my professionalism. I didn't agree right away. It was important to me not to disappear into his business, but to become a partner. We discussed everything beforehand, divided up responsibilities, and defined boundaries. It was a completely different experience, healthy, mature, and honest. Working with suppliers, I quickly noticed oddities. One of them, a grocery supply company, consistently charged above market rates. Meanwhile, the quality left much to be desired, and delivery delays were becoming regular. I began digging deeper, cross-checking data, and retrieving old contracts. The numbers didn't lie. It was during this period that I received my first call in years from an unfamiliar number. I didn't know that this call would become a bridge between my past and present lives. That everything I'd spent so long running for would come knocking on my door again. But now I was no longer the girl you could throw out of the house with a bag of clothes. I was a grown woman, standing on a solid foundation I'd built myself. The phone rang one evening as I sat at the kitchen table, supplier reports spread out before me. It was slowly getting dark outside, the city was falling asleep, and I was still running numbers through my head that wouldn't add up. The screen showed an unknown number. Something inside me tightened, but I answered anyway. "Lauren." A familiar voice rang out, sending a chill down my spine. "It's Madison." It had been almost 10 years since I'd last heard her. During that time, I'd imagined many times what I'd say if she suddenly showed up. But the words never came. "What do you need?" I asked calmly, surprised by my own restraint. She laughed, briefly and tensely. "Don't be so cold. We're family. I just wanted to talk, meet, have coffee." "Talk now," I replied. "I have no desire to meet." There was a pause, then her voice grew harsher. "Your husband is going to break his contract with Green Harvest. That's a very bad idea." It all came together instantly, like a puzzle I'd already held in my hands. "Is that the company your fiancé works for?" I clarified. "He's the owner," Madison said forcefully. "And we need the money now. We're planning a wedding. You understand the expenses involved." I closed my eyes. Even after all these years, She hadn't changed. You overcharged, delivered expired goods, and violated the terms of the contract, I said. That's not business, that's fraud. Don't be dramatic, she snapped irritably. Just talk to Ethan.
Talk to him.
You owe me. Obligated. I felt a familiar, but no longer paralyzing, wave of anger rise inside me. For what exactly? For everything, she snapped. For always ruining my life. I laughed. Not loudly, but sincerely.
No, Madison.
I won't do anything. And if you try to pressure me again, I'll hand over all the materials to the appropriate authorities. She cursed and hung up. Half an hour later, Mom called. Her voice was as harsh as ever. What are you doing? She began without greeting. You're ruining your sister's future. I listened to her in silence. Then I said, I'm not ruining anyone's life. I simply refuse to participate in the deception. You've always been jealous, she spat. If it weren't for you, we'd have a normal family. A normal family doesn't kick a child out of the house for lying, I replied. And they don't use them as a source of income. She fell silent. I continued, my voice no longer shaking. I know about the money, about why you kept me around, and I know you never wanted to hear the truth. You're ungrateful, she said finally. After everything I've done for you. You've done nothing for me, I interrupted. Everything good in my life has happened despite you, not because of you. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't weakness. It was release. I told Ethan everything. About the calls, about the blackmail, about the past. He listened attentively, without interrupting. When I finished, he took my hand. I've already made my decision, he said. We're breaking the contract. And I'll notify the other cafe owners. Such schemes shouldn't work. He did more. He shared the data I'd collected with industry colleagues. The reaction was swift. One after another, restaurants dropped Green Harvest. The company's reputation was shattered in a matter of weeks. Madison's wedding never happened. They married quietly, without ceremony. I learned about it from my grandmother. Helen came to visit us and told us everything without malice, simply as a fact. You did the right thing, she said. Sometimes the truth is all we have. Mom didn't call anymore. Later, I learned she'd tried to turn my grandmother against me, but she'd already made her choice. She'd rewritten her will, leaving everything to me. Not out of revenge, but out of love. I sat in our garden, watching the sun set behind the rooftops, and for the first time, I felt complete peace. The past no longer weighed me down. It had become part of history, but it no longer defined me. I didn't receive an apology. I didn't hear remorse. But I received something more, a life where I'm chosen. A husband who respects me. A home where there's no fear. A job built on honesty. Sometimes family isn't the people who gave you your name, but the people who gave you a choice. And I made mine. My life story was no longer the story of a victim. It was the story of a woman who persevered, walked away, and built everything anew. And that was my true victory.